So today is Saturday, December 5th. This is the first day of our 2020 Zoom Rohatsu session, which we're doing in conjunction with Vermont Zen Center, Toronto Zen Center, Casa Zen Costa Rica in San Jose, and of course with Endless Path Zendo here in Rochester. Uh, because because this is the Rohatsu, what I'd like to do is each Teisho to deal with an aspect of the Buddha's enlightenment, that is the historical or legendary record. So we'll begin with his leaving home and see how that connects to our own practice. And then from there, we'll move on day by day to enlightenment and to the enlightenment ceremony on Tuesday, which we will join the Vermont Zendo, so that, and Toronto and Costa Rica, so that everyone is there for that ceremony. If you can make it, whether you're in Sesshin that day or not, please feel free to join us. And that will start exactly at 9:30. Uh, so my teacher, Danon Henry Roshi, founder of the Zen Center of Denver, once asked me, what keeps you practicing all these years? I answered the life of the Buddha and the Jataka tales. And he said, well, we have ordination here. Is that something you might be interested in? That little chat with him led to my full black robe ordination as a Zen priest. But this was something that Danon had actually created, that is ordination at the same level as a monk or priest, but taken and actualized as a layperson, which is what I did. I had no interest in not being or remaining a layperson. So interestingly, now I look back and I see that this little conversation set in motion my becoming Danon's Dharma heir and then a Zen teacher at this point. So from there, starting about 10 years ago, because Sunyana Graf Roshi had a very similar affinity to the issue of the life of the Buddha as being really the core of our practice and the Jataka tales, we now have our unique contribution to Zen in the West, which is our annual Jataka Sesshin. Some of you have been to those, or at least you've heard Teishos on the Jatakas or read about the Jatakas. And of course, you know then that they reveal that for the Buddha, ongoing practice realization was the key. It was never about a one-time experience. It was always about ongoing, continuous practice. And these stories show too that this aspiration toward ongoing, more and more selfless practice is the essence of the vow of the Bodhisattva. That is the one determined to mature beyond habitual self-centeredness and be of use to all beings. Master Hakuin says that rolling forward the wheel of the vow is what helps us to mature most directly. Without this vow to continue on and become able to ultimately benefit all beings, Kensho itself fades into something of lesser value. So the vow, Hakuin says, is like our eyes. It helps us to see the path. It helps us to see our lives. And we protect then the vow like our eyes at all costs. How do we do that? Well, by upholding it, by practicing it. This sustained exertion is what Zen Master Dogen says, is at the core again of practice, but it's not a light matter because really, to be honest, no one yearns for a life of continuous effort. That's not what we come about thinking towards. But Dogen says that in the end, this sustained exertion, this continuous effort alone is our final refuge. So everything we care most deeply about rides in on this continuous effort. Buddhist tradition holds that the Buddha told Jataka tales, sharing his personal path of awakening practice with his Sangha for only one reason, and that was to help others fulfill their vow. He wasn't doing it to polish his own crown or to wax nostalgic. It wasn't like, well, when I was a boy, I walked 10 miles to school in a blizzard, barefoot, in minus 20-degree weather. That wasn't his style. He wasn't reminiscing. It was simply that there was an opportunity in his community, an issue had arisen that a Jataka tale could help open up the way to practice with this or what was going on. So in his stories, he makes it clear that he wasn't special at all. He had doubts. He made errors. He faltered. But, and maybe what might have been unique is that whatever came his way, whatever error, whatever mistake, whatever difficulty, he just kept going. Once he saw a need to start working on himself, he didn't, well, it's hard to say. I'm not going to say, I was going to say he didn't take long gaps, but there's no way of knowing that. All we can say is that he continued on through everything that came his way. And that means to be like the Buddha doesn't mean sitting cross-legged. It doesn't mean having a half smile on your face. It doesn't mean being calm when things are really going completely nuts. It simply means the willingness to do the work of facing up to and working with, not evading the life challenges that come our unique way, our own karma, and then to just keep going sincerely and honestly as possible. Aiken Roshi once told me that in Japan, karma is termed simply mysterious affinities. It is rather inexplicable, isn't it? How we establish personal relationships and marriages, how we gather friends, how we find children and grandchildren appearing in our lives, how we create careers, all of this. How does this come about? Even to brush sleeves with someone we pass on the street is traceable to an endlessly receding series of mysterious affinities. So again, our practice is to work with our own mysterious affinities in light of our own life. So now we're going to really take a look at the life of the Buddha, and we'll re-enter kind of the pre-Zen world of ancient India. His final efforts toward enlightenment are said to have taken place on the 12th month, 8th day. This is the literal meaning of Ro Hatsu. Ro Hatsu is 12th month, 8th day. And this is the day in Zen tradition that the Buddha sat down under the Bodhi tree and realized complete, full, and perfect enlightenment. Actually, he sat down the night before, but it was the morning of the 8th, which is when our session will end, on the 8th. Motivated by his past life efforts to get there, Prince Siddhartha first sets out for the last time on the final steps of his journey by leaving his home. With leaving home, the Jatakas segue from myth to history, and this is what we'll look at today. Leaving home, which is what we've all done to enter Sesshin. We've left our normal routines, we've left our normal thought patterns, we've left all the things that we've identified with up to this moment, and we stepped into Zendo and into Sesshin, and we've joined with others to accomplish something that moves us deeply, moves us to continue making this effort. So, in terms of the Buddha's leaving home, why did he leave? Uh, in some past life Jatakas, the Buddha was a king who practices completely, fully, compassionately, wisely, but doesn't leave, stays a layperson and practices in that way. And in some Jatakas, the Buddha is a realized sage in past lives, maybe a hermit on the mountains, yet he makes a mistake. He makes a serious error, has to call himself to task and then get back to the real work again. So the path can take any number of forms, but sincerity, a vow towards something more remains key. D.H. Lawrence, writing in The Man Who Died, a kind of novella he wrote. If you've never read it, I do recommend it. It's an odd and interesting piece and has a great, interesting kind of wisdom behind it. He's writing about Christ, of course, who he never names. He calls him the man who died. And in The Man Who Died, D.H. Lawrence puts it like this about that why do we leave home? Why did the Buddha leave home? He says, it was the life of the little day. And the man who had died said to himself, unless we encompass it in the greater day and set the little life in the circle of the greater life, all is disaster. Unless we set the little life in the circle of the greater life, all is disaster. We live self-centeredly. We make all kinds of mistakes because of that, and we cause harm to ourselves and others. D.H. Lawrence says it very clearly. Roshi Kapleau used to say, unless we have some degree of realization, a tiny bit, doesn't matter how much, he said, it's very hard not to fail to see clearly or very hard to see clearly and so not go astray. And he says, even with some realization, it's not so easy to avoid going astray. So leaving home. By the way, final thing, Aiken Roshi used to say something similar, but what he would say was from the practice side. He would say, not enough yet, not yet enough. So, Prince Siddhartha, you know the story. I'll give you a bit of a synopsis. So, he was approaching the age of 30, and he was a prince, Siddhartha Gautama, and one day decides to leave the protection of his palace and head out at last for the first time, legends say, from the palace grounds onto the streets of his city. There, over a 4-day period, he dramatically encounters what are classically described as the 4 ego-devastating signs. He sees a sick man, and for the first time is appalled to discover that everyone gets sick. He sees an old man and is horrified to find out that everyone gets old. He sees a dead man and is shocked, terrified to learn that even the most privileged die. Then he sees a truth seeker and realizes that there is a path leading to something more. Sheltered as he's been, he's never known these things before. Astonishing. But then, after taking it all in, despite the luxuries he's been accustomed to all his life, and the personal attachments at the core of his present identity, he leaves his home determined to find that greater truth, that circle of greater life, and bring back something of value to all, or die in the attempt. In short, this is the story of when he discovers his own commitment to truth, the practice of truth, to others, and to something greater than himself. Here's a little fragment. It's actually a very short poem by Ko Un, who was a very important contemporary Korean poet who had been a Zen monk and then became an activist and a poet. He wrote, if leaving home is what a monk's job involves, then coming home really, really is what a Buddha's job is. But surely you can only come home if you've really left home, can't you? You can only come home, really, if you've really left home. So here's the story of Siddhartha from a Zen perspective, his leaving home. At Siddhartha's birth, the name means every wish fulfilled. A sage predicted that if the child was kept from all knowledge of impermanence, eventually he'd be a world ruler. But if he saw impermanence, he would give up the throne and all worldly power and become an awakened Buddha. His father, King Suddhodana, a king in a long line of kings, wanted his son to follow his footsteps and fulfill the family tradition of royal life. And so he tried to keep all signs of impermanence from his son. So the legend is that the prince grew up knowing only happiness and pleasure. But really, can even the most sheltered child know only contentment? Does the sun always shine? Is a toe never stubbed? Does a pet never die? A chill wind never blow? After all, the boy's own mother, Queen Maya, had died 7 days before his birth. He never knew her. His maternal aunt, Prajapati, had stepped in to become his stepmother. So we have to assume that Siddhartha's father was fighting the losing battle of a man taking arms against the sea. He was like a man trying to stop the sun from rising, and he probably knew it. For one day, the time just comes. A growing person can't live locked up, even in a palace, not forever. Every comfort zone becomes a prison in time. So one day, we're told at the age of 29, the deeply sheltered Prince Gotama, Siddhartha Gautama, walked out from his palace into the streets of Kapilavastu. And when he did, when he stepped out of his beautiful yet confining palace, he suddenly found that everything he'd thought of as being solid, set, and dependable was no more permanent than dust on the wind. That realization that all things sicken, all things age and die, hit him so very hard, in part because he had been so protected and isolated. His father's efforts had actually backfired, exacerbating the very problem it sought to avoid. The young prince was so wide open, so totally vulnerable, that when he went out into ordinary human life, he really crashed into it. I mean, we've grown up with the facts of our intrinsic difficulty, the basic difficulty of being aware and so knowing that we're impermanent. We've seen it so many times, we've become hardened, inured, inoculated against this fundamental human terror. Unless something hits us hard, like sickness or some deep loss, we just tend to go along more or less unconscious of the great funeral blaze already burning beneath our feet. But Prince Siddhartha had no armor of familiarity. Seeing it directly and raw for the first time, it hit him so hard that he plunged into despair. But though delicate and overly protected, he was actually made of sterner stuff. We all are. We all can take it. He didn't melt. We won't either. Indeed, the Prince Siddhartha quickly rallied, and then he grew absolutely determined. From that moment on, he would live with open eyes without taking refuge in any of our ordinary escapist conditions of trance, fantasy, cynicism, hedonism. In some 4 billion years or so, even our sun will die. What then? Where does impermanence end? Where does time stop? Over just a few days, this once sheltered prince moved decisively and courageously from living within a fantasy to absolute realism, which didn't mean he became some kind of hard ass. It wasn't cynicism. Or, let's say, he didn't think maybe it was simply that he would no longer accept an answer that was sort of like, well, when you get to heaven, it will all make sense to you. To his newly opened eyes, that too smacked of self protective wish fulfillment. When you get to heaven, it'll all make sense. Instead, his question became, is there a path based on actual facts that lead to freedom now, right within our condition of impermanence, within aging, sickness, and death? If there was, he was determined to take it and walk it to the end, come hell or high water. With his experience of the four signs, aging, sickness, death, and a truth seeker, Siddhartha's road to world rule was totally demolished. Shocked, dismayed, yet determined to find an answer, he left home, wife, newborn son, father, foster mother, luxuries, attendants. Beneath his distress may now have been hope, as well as some vague sense that he was being pushed as if by circumstance onto the very road he'd been unconsciously seeking all along. He wasn't running away. He was trying to find a way that would benefit all, including his father, foster mother, wife, and child, like a soldier going off to fight a necessary war. At the same time, his faith in what was familiar and comfortable had been shattered. He wasn't leaving home. Stripped of everything he'd clung to, he no longer had a home. The destined path reveals itself. We've seen this in literature and movies so many times. Frodo leaves the Shire, Luke heads off with Obi-Wan. The safety and security of the old homestead is gone, gone, entirely gone. Though Prince Siddhartha stood at the edge of the vast, empty ground of reality, it would still take even him 6 more years of intensely focused and committed practice before it would be clear. For now, with the overwhelming loss of all the young prince had previously known and believed, he enters the first gate of the noble truths, the gate of anguish. With the four signs, the solid walls that had sheltered, protected, and isolated him are smashed to rubble. He sees there is no haven from the universal catastrophe. Illness might be prevented and aging slowed, but all must eventually swirl down the great drain of death. His sense of entitlement and safety is stripped away. No longer an onlooker, exposed and vulnerable, he finds that he's been living a dream, his attractive life a painted corpse. This painful stripping of childish certainties is not unique. We resonate with it because we actually all know exactly how it feels. We resonate with this because at some point we've each had our own insight into the same devastation. Thinking that disillusionment is final truth, some get stuck there. Others, trying to hide from their own insight, seek distractions. Perhaps much of the gross national product is the result of a mass flight from reality, driven by repressed anxiety over the inescapable truths of sickness, aging, and death. Some seek to amass possessions, and not just possessions, but power, as a bulwark against the defeat that deep down we all know is heading for us with the relentless pace of the ticking clock. Yet Prince Siddhartha's response is none of these. He does not turn and run. He does not try to repress what he knows to be true. He does not hide, attempting to build a bigger, better, even more sheltering palace. He does not become enraged, taking out his despair on others. Instead, he becomes completely emotionally naked, letting everything he'd once thought to be so drop away. Experiencing the anguish of the first noble truth, he courageously lets all he's known come to nothing. It is a kind of awakening. The question of what remains when everything we've known, clung to, or believed is gone lies at the heart, the core of religious practice, whatever name we call it. And it can be a turning point directly into reality, which doesn't mean that it's easy. Case 27 of the Blue Cliff Record, a monk asked Yun Men, "How is it when the trees wither and the leaves fall?" Yun Men answered, "Body exposed in the golden breeze." Nirvana was traditionally, or is traditionally, described as cool and comfortable because the heat of delusions, of false passions, and self-centered clinging, the three poisons, that is, of greed, hatred, and ignorance, have been blown out, which is the literal meaning of nirvana, blown out like a candle, blown out in the wind, body exposed in the golden breeze. When all is gone, gone, entirely gone, as the Prajna Paramita Hridaya Heart of Perfect Wisdom Sutra says, we may find not despair or nothingness, but wisdom and peace. Manjushri, Bodhisattva of wisdom, the patron of Zendos, is often shown with his right hand up, swinging the Prajna sword that cuts through duality. And in his other hand is the lotus of awakening, and on it is the book or scroll of perfect wisdom, Prajna Paramita. Zen's position is that this wisdom is not added to us. We do not gain it by our work in practice, though its functioning typically unfolds over time. Rather, it is revealed as the sort of practice realization cuts through. In other words, when everything we've self-centeredly clung to, dualistically clung to, is even for a moment gone, original non-dual wisdom is all that's there. It reveals itself. We find that wisdom is already ours. We find we're already riding on the lion of Manjushri, the noblest of beasts. We find that this great loss called nirvana is actually a great relief. We touch base with this in small ways in our daily zazen. Breath by breath, we release the ancient dualistic burden of me in here and everything else out there. Losing is gaining. The small self-centered life finds its fulfillment in the circle of the greater life, as D.H. Lawrence wrote. Still, it takes courage to face into the wind of impermanence, which, like the big bad wolf, is blowing our house down. The Prince Siddhartha is well prepared. Not that he knew it, but he was, sustained and guided by his own past efforts, the work done through what Zen Master Dogen termed countless kalpas of assiduous practice, which is what's shown in the Jataka tales. Though the tale of home leaving is central to classical accounts of the Buddha's life, how possible is it really that even a perfectly sheltered prince would only see illness, old age, death, and a spiritual seeker for the first time at the age of 29? How likely is it that he'd never encountered a sick person or an old one? Maybe he'd never seen a dead person, but wouldn't it be hard to avoid dead pets or dead bugs? Then again, perhaps there's nothing unusual about seeing as if for the first time. Zen mind, beginner's mind, may now be a cliche, but here's a haiku. Ah, I said, ah. It was all I could say. The cherry flowers of Mount Yoshino. That's a haiku of Teishitsu. Indeed, I see the cherry flowers that open each spring, but now as if for the first time, ah, I said, ah. It was all I could say. The cherry flowers of Mount Yoshino. Wonderful beginner's mind. When was it that we first saw sickness, old age, and death with such a mind? The prince's response is not simply naive. With his habitual filters removed, he saw sickness, old age, and death as if for the first time. A haiku by Shohaku hits the same note. A starlit night, the sky, the size of it, the extent of it, to be utterly struck by what is utterly familiar can be a decisive life moment. Prince Siddhartha's mind was blown open, seeing afresh what had been hiding in plain sight. Perhaps he exclaimed with this beginner's mind, the sick man, ah, the pity of such a life. The old woman, alas, for the ugliness of such a life. When was it we first wised up? When we first got slugged between the eyes by the ordinary truth that everyone gets sick? When were we gut punched by the realization that even our own cherished bodies must stiffen in time? When were we stunned to understand down to the ventricles of our heart that everyone, the pilot, bus driver, waiter, genius bar person at Apple, our partner or child would age and die, and no amount of wealth or success could prevent it? How many times did we walk out of our palace thinking ourselves well protected before our walls came crashing down? For Siddhartha, the privileged kid from the rich side of the tracks, it hit him at the age of 29 over an intense 3 or 4 day period. Wham! And just like that, it was done. By the way, the fourth sign Siddhartha saw was probably not a monk. There was no Buddhism yet. So it was probably a kind of ascetic truth seeker, which has a very ancient Indian tradition. But the point simply is that when the Bodhisattva saw that, he realized that what he thought was the end of his road might actually only be its beginning. And that's the important part of that fourth sign. When you've come to what you thought was the end of the road, you might find it's really only the beginning. Typically, it's as teenagers that we all first begin to get that something's rotten, as Hamlet says, out in the big, wide world we're preparing to enter. In traditional cultures, puberty is a time of initiation, a time to die to childish illusions and be born finally as functioning adults. To live fully, we must die to all that is old, habitual, and unexamined. Zazen is our daily practice of this. Letting go of thoughts we've identified with, thoughts of I'm in here and you're out there. Letting thought sequences become porous, even transparent, is a kind of dying to old ideas, hopes, fears, and conditioning. Momentarily letting go, we wake to what and where we are. We see the wall, the wall. See the floor, the grain of the wood floor. We hear the whoosh of traffic, the barking dogs, the groaning furnace, the wind blowing, the caw of crows. Ordinary things are fresh and new, as if seen or heard for the first time. So begins our path through the mental fog. We enter a sangha, we encounter teachers and guides. If we're lucky, we come to see what the Bodhisattva saw, not that everything is okay and we can just go home again, thank goodness, and forget the anguish now that we have a practice, isn't it wonderful? But rather, that there is a path that only appears, indeed can only appear, when our own old house lies in ruins. Without a model or map, the path can be hard to find. With it, which is in a sense what Buddhism is, a map of the way, we begin to walk our own version of the road. It may be a long, winding, twisting road with sheer drops and fitful starts and stops. But if we keep going, keep finding our way each time we get lost, eventually what's been lost and shattered is found, and it is whole. Our original home is everywhere. Everywhere is home. The ancient empty house that stood from the beginning without walls, windows, door, roof, or floor is unbreakable. To leave or be forced from the fragile, breakable home built out of our own egotistic self involvement is a first step toward coming home to what will not collapse in ruin. What is breakable must break so that what is unbreakable may be found. As Crazy Jane says to the bishop in Yeats's poem of that name, nothing is soul or whole that has not been rent. Nothing can be whole unless, in other words, it is first torn, broken, shattered. Jataka tradition insists that this wasn't the first time the Bodhisattva set out from home as a seeker of truth. Rather, it was one of many. There's a Jataka in which he's a long-lived king. He finds a single gray hair among his black locks and takes this as a sign of impermanence so deep that he believes it's sent by the gods. And even though he had, in that life, had 84,000 years of life still remaining to him, obviously in a past world age, he leaves his throne to his son because of that one gray hair and sets off to dedicate himself fully to spiritual practice. So he's done this before, only this time, with this home leaving, the devastation is complete. It is ripeness, the blossoming of seeds he himself had planted with his own efforts long ago. The 4 ego-devastating signs are actually the ringing of his own Jataka set alarm clock. Wake up, wake up. Time to finish the job and realize enlightenment for the benefit of all. At some point, our palace walls too crumble, and our locked doors swing open. And like Siddhartha, we head out into the darkness where nothing can be known any longer in its old, limited, self-centered way. Going past the boundaries of our parents' kingdom, past the limits of all we've inherited, mentally or in any other way, emotionally, in any other way, we head out for ourselves into the endless forest and mountains, into the vast unnamed expanse of what actually is, all lesser purposes burned away. In so many ways, the Buddha's life story is really our own. Many true paths begin with disaster. Our ship sinks, our train gets wrecked, our plans fail, our hearts break. A whirlwind carries our house away, leaving us naked and exposed. Or we cause enough pain to others to jolt ourselves momentarily awake. If we're lucky, like Prince Siddhartha, we may get a glimpse of the path. Maybe we meet an actual person. Maybe we see a video of the Dalai Lama. Maybe we read a book. Whatever it is, there is a shift, a turning of our life's page. The young prince in India long ago presents the pattern. It's a universal pattern. It's everyone's pattern. This is one reason that Joseph Campbell repeats in many places in his writing that Buddhism is the closest thing we have to a planetary religion. But according to the Jatakas, this home leaving had lots of preparation, of course. He'd already been householder, parent, monk, layperson, merchant, soldier, artist, caravan leader, hermit, bridge builder, king, prince, acrobat, thief, sage, child of an ogre, businessman, teacher, doctor. No human realm was excluded. And there were also his countless animal lives, or his non-human beings, nagas, tree serpents, devas, or gods, The path of awakening is not about wearing a halo, not being super calm in the midst of difficult circumstance. It's not even about being wise. If it were, I wouldn't be sitting here. In the Jatakas, the Buddha is shown struggling, making mistakes. Even for the Buddha, the path took time to mature. His sincerity, commitment, and integrity evolved. Perseverance fueled by deep vows was the was the key. And of course, he didn't leave home to become spiritual. It wasn't, I've seen impermanence, now I'm going to get enlightened. No, it was a much more Godot-like, how can I go on? I must go on. Or Dylan's, there must be some way out of here. There's too much confusion. I can't get no relief. But young Prince Siddhartha, and the name Siddhartha means every wish fulfilled, said, I will find a way that aids not just myself, but all. Yet even for the Buddha, dying to his own old world, being stripped of everything he'd held dear and clung to and believed in, was hard. He was human. Yet in that very difficulty, something was waking up. In losing everything, he'd refound a road to which he'd never even consciously realized that he'd lost. In losing everything, he refound the road that would lead to what he never even consciously knew that he had lost. Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva of compassion, is sometimes shown with 11 heads, so she can see all beings in their suffering, and 1,000 arms, and in each arm, in the palm of the hand, is an eye to skillfully guide that hand to where the eyes see a need. Heads and eyes are her response to suffering, a way of not just sitting with it, but a way of doing something about it. The Bodhisattva, experiencing devastation and leaving home, and Avalokiteshvara opening all those eyes and hands happen at the same time. Heading out the door is opening the eyes to truth. There is impermanence. There is anguish. Not to see this is to have eyes shut. The path of Zen practice, the path of minute by minute sustained exertion that Dogen says is our only real refuge, begins with the first noble truth, the realization of suffering's reality, the realization of our own anguish. Discovering that its cause lies in our wrong views is the second noble truth. Realizing this, we gain the power to transform our lives and end unnecessary suffering. That's the third noble truth. Walking the path of actual practice realization, the eightfold path in our daily lives is the fourth. This path frees us from the causes of sorrow, our own stubbornly fixed beliefs in the solid ego inside, and everything else, trees, bugs, clouds, stars, mountains, rivers, animals, people, somewhere out there. There are people who say they don't believe in anything, yet if you poke them, you soon see that they believe in quite a lot. They believe in the fixed reality of a forever separate, forever isolated ego self as all they are. The Buddha, too, started out as an ordinary person, believing himself separate and alone. Yet the four ego-devastating signs helped him cut his attachment to that belief and transformed it into a motivation for wisdom and compassion. Yet he didn't think his way to liberation. He wasn't a philosopher. He was a realizer, someone who simply had enough and decided to do whatever's needed to wake up. The first noble truth is noble, not because its pain is somehow ennobling, because it is a first step on the journey of waking up to all the good, the fantastically good that's even now beneath our feet. This is where the Zen, and by that I mean our own Zen path, begins. Though that path is beyond simple, it's not easy. It takes focus, sacrifice, courage, and perseverance. Leaving our old palace of certain certainties is how we start. Eventually, we develop the strength to leave the most seemingly certain certainty of all, the certainty that I'm in here and everything else is out there. Going is how we find the strength to eventually go all the way. It begins with a vow, a deep-seated vow to become a genuine human being, an authentic human being, no longer driven by habitually self-centered greed, anger, and ignorance. A vow to realize our own nature, our very own mind, which is itself always closer than close. This great vow to attain the Buddha way is actualized now, the only time we have. It is made real with this moment, this count. 1, 2, 3. This breath, this specific koan point. The good news is that leaving home is coming home, as over the next few days we shall see. So we will recite our great vows for all, and then we will have our Kinhin, and then we will rejoin Endless Path Zendo. For people who came in late, please know that if you read your directions carefully, you're to be in Endless Path Zendo event at 9:15 sharp, not in the Vermont Zendo. And Sesshin then starts at 9:30 sharp. So as Sunyana Roshi announced this morning, please make sure you're on time and in the right place, okay? Thanks. Okay, so I will turn this around so we can look at the Buddha, and let's recite. Let me unplug a couple of things here. Hold on, and I will stop the recording. Thank you very much. Stop that.